Director of Academic Education in the Faculty of Education, and his research is also in education and education policy. And the title is Educating for Future Societies. So
yeah, I sort of suspect that Mikhail and I were put in sequence for a reason, I don't know, but I'm going to talk about affordances. And at least that will be part of what I'm going to talk to. I was actually kind of worried whether I would spend too much time on affordances, but I think that that's actually justified at this point, because I think that the conceptualization of affordances that I'm going to present is somewhat different than what Mikhail was referring to. But so basically my research, I'm going to talk a little bit about my research and then connect that to some of the other work that goes on within the university, and in particular the School of Education. But I'm going to start off with sort of this talk about the future and so why we are concerned with the future. And I think for education, I mean, we heard about before the importance of history, and certainly history is important, especially with education. We stand on the shoulders of giants, as they say. But if we think about what education does, and for example, that we are a school of education, we are tasked with preparing the teachers of the future. And if we think about, so here in Iceland today, for full teacher licensure, a master's degree is required. And that means a total of 5 years of university education. Then we see those teachers going into the schools, and over the next 5 years, they might be developing or moving into leadership positions. So if we think about that initial and sort of early professional development of teachers, that's at least 10 years. So what education we provide to them should perhaps prepare them for the realities 10 years from now, 10 years into the future. Now, if we look at what our teachers then do, that they go and teach in the schools, all the way from pre-primary education up to university level. And there we're talking about time spans of up to 15 years. That's the total time that youth go to school. And so we might think about, well, what is the society going to look like that we're preparing them for? And so this easily starts to escalate, and we move very rapidly towards the future. So even though people might think, when we say we should be thinking about what the society will look like in 15 years from now, they might think that that's a long time. That when we put that into that context, then it's not really a very long time. So this is one of the things that we're trying to do, is to try to find ways of integrating maybe more futures perspectives into teacher education. Now, working with futures is certainly nothing new, and there have been a number of futuring and foresight activities relating to education over decades. But some of the problems with particularly foresight programs relating to education, and this goes for programs that have been implemented on a European level and by OECD on national levels, that they tend to adopt relatively short time frames, that generally most foresight and futuring programs limit their perspective to 5 to 10 years. And given sort of the way technology develops, that's often less really a future and more of an extension of the present. That is, that they're just working with the technological paradigms that are emerging in the present and looking at them over a relatively short time span. And because of that, there tends to be too much of a focus on what technologies are available today. People think in terms of the technologies that they're familiar with and extend that over over several years. And so the expiration dates for these activities tends to be very short. That basically they're outdated after 5 years because technology has moved beyond what was assumed at the start. And so what we feel is really needed is that we need to have more robust futures that adopt timeframes that allow us to really work with novel ideas and innovations, and not just the paradigms that that exist today. And part of the challenge with that is that, especially when we're working in the future of education, we have to have the people who shape education with us in those activities. And in general, teachers and others who work in education are not necessarily specialists either in technology development, futures, etc., which are sort of the skills that you would need to do that very well. So we need to find ways to prepare them to work with us to develop these future visions. And that's where the concept of affordances comes in. And now, before I go on, that I feel that I need to clarify sort of this concept of affordances. And when Mikhail was talking about affordances, I saw that, okay, there's definitely a need to do this, because essentially we have developed two mutually exclusive conceptualizations of affordances, especially in literature relating to education. So that in educational technology, the concept of affordances is very common. It's become so commonplace that people don't even cite resources when they use it. And it's assumed that people know what we're talking about. And the thing is that the difficulty with this is that these two concepts, we have the original concept that was defined by Gibson, which I'm not going to read it, I'll allow you to read it here if you can, was adopted by Norman. And Don Norman, he altered the concept. He introduced it as a design concept. And some of the key differences there, we can see in the definitions that Gibson, for example, makes no mention of properties, whereas for Don Norman, affordances are properties of objects. And as Mikhail said, affordances are what an object displays to an individual that lets the individual know how to use that object. This is the Norman definition of affordances, whereas Gibson, he proposed the concept more as an ecological concept, that affordances arise out of interactions and relationships between individuals, or animals as he termed it, and their environment. And so it's a much broader concept than Norman's. Norman suggests that we see, okay, a button, and we know instinctively we're supposed to push a button. Whereas I think Gibson wouldn't go that far. He would say there's a button, and what that button means to you at any time depends on what it is you want to do, what you're trying to do. It could mean something entirely different than something you push. And my sort of go-to example for this is the common shoe. Okay, we have a conceptualization of what a shoe is. It's something we put on our feet to protect our feet when we're walking and this sort of thing. But I may be standing in my foyer and I see a spider on the floor, and I instinctively grab a shoe, and that shoe immediately becomes a spider killing machine, something that has nothing to do with a shoe. And there's not necessarily anything about the shoe that tells me it could be a spider killing machine. And so Norman has a very difficult time explaining how we do this, how we adopt and recreate this meaning out of almost nothing. And so what I want to do now, and to sort of carry on, is that the concept of affordances that I am using is Gibson's concept of affordances. And just to keep that in mind, that it's a very open and flexible concept. And this is very important when we come to discussing technologies, because a lot of the technologies that we are dealing with today, they don't necessarily let us know what they're for. And they're not necessarily intended for specific tasks. One of the best examples that I know of how this can play out is Twitter, where Twitter as a social media platform developed in ways that were entirely unexpected by the developers, that users started using the platform in ways that they had not designed it for. And then we would say that the users discovered affordances within that platform that suited their needs. Okay. And I'm going to jump over some of my, well, actually, I'm going to stick to this one because this is sort of what I call my litmus test for whether a conceptualization of affordances is aligned with Gibson's definition or not. And really it is understanding what Gibson's purpose with defining the concept was. And his purpose was, he was like many thinkers of his time. This is around the 60s, 50s, 60s. And he was thinking, how do we sort of work around this ingrained conceptualization of dualism? And he wanted to say that meaning emerges from the environment, that there's not two distinct realms that we're working with, but meaning just emerges as we deal with our environment. And if there is a conceptualization or a definition of affordances that does not align with that ideal of Gibson's, then basically it's a different concept. And I think this has caused considerable confusion, certainly in educational technology, that we have these two concepts that use the same word, but they're really referring to quite different things. Whereas Norman is always saying we signal our meaning, Gibson is saying, no, the meaning emerges through our interactions. So, as I said, this has become very widespread, this concept of affordances in educational technology, but it is Norman's concept. And what I want to do is to sort of shift us to Gibson's concept, back to Gibson's concept, because I think it's more open, it's more flexible, and in particular, if we're talking about future technologies, Norman's conceptualization of affordances becomes very problematic because he says that the object announces its usability, its function. And when we're talking about the future, we're essentially talking about objects, about technologies that do not yet exist. And so there's nothing for them to display. Whereas Gibson's concept is more open, and we can use that to discover potential affordances of technologies, even though they do not exist today. So just to sort of how we're working on this, that I've been developing teaching materials that focus on sort of 5 of the biggest technological developments that routinely emerge in discourse on the future of education, and looking at technology as a force driving change. And some of the problems are that they're very jargony, and they use concepts that refer to often objects and technologies that people have a certain familiarity with. And that hinders them from actually visualizing something radically different. And this is sort of a key in what we're trying to do, because we contend that a future technology is quite specifically something different than what exists today. So for example, we might say, we might talk about artificial intelligence. And by now people have a certain idea of what artificial intelligence is. And they will visualize perhaps an object like this. This is very common. It's Amazon's Alexa. This is what constitutes artificial intelligence today. But we have to get beyond that, because what we're talking about 10 years from now is something very different than this. It has to be, because technology continues to develop. So we try to work out phrasings for technological developments that avoid the jargon, the familiarity, so that people are open to exploring new affordances. And if we take just one example, if we consider artificial intelligence, that what the concept of affordances encourages us to do is to think about the holistic environment that the technology occurs in, right? And then we think about, okay, the individual, what is the individual attempting to do? And we can derive affordances of technologies that don't exist yet necessarily from that. And so for example, if we had a virtual teaching assistant in a classroom, we'll call it a classroom for now, then what are the things that, for example, from the student's perspective, that technology could afford them? Okay, and we can start to list those. And I've marked in red some of the ones that are perhaps not necessarily positive uses. They might be negative uses. And we have to keep that in mind, that these are equal affordances as the positive uses. This is basically, these are things that can happen. And then having sort of gone through some of these ideas about how the technology presents itself within a certain environment, we go back and we reiterate and we revisit some of the key concepts within that environment that we're exploring. And so we have to ask ourselves, okay, if there's a virtual teaching assistant present in the learning environment, what does that mean for the concept of a classroom? What does that mean for the concept of a textbook, et cetera, because these kinds of technologies, of course, change that. And we have to sort of go into and figure out, well, what is the entire ecology of that environment that we're dealing with? So, and sort of getting to my point with all of this, that essentially this, like Mikhail, there are so many similarities between what Mikhail was talking about and what I'm talking about, that this requires some sort of interdisciplinarity. And this requires inputs that are beyond what is often within the realm of educational sciences, having deep insights into technological developments and that sort of thing. And so what we are doing is we are looking to establish within the University of Iceland, or within the School of Education, a Center for Educational Innovation. And our idea of this, for this Center of Educational Innovation, is that it will be situated within one of the university's innovation centers, and within the Educational Innovation Center will be a hub for the future of education. And this we would like to develop as a platform for interdisciplinarity, where we can bring together people from the educational sciences, from other fields, including technology and others, and create a synergy where we can start exploring what are the possibilities for the future, both in education and in broader context. Because of course, in the end, the purpose of education is to prepare people to be participants within society. And so the whole concept of what do we mean by a digital society or a global society, citizenship, that these all sort of fall into that general framework of exploring what it is that we're trying to prepare people for and, and how we do it. So that was essentially, I don't think if I was trying to be cautious of not going over my time because I know we're already somewhat behind. And have I used up my time or? I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
2 minutes left. You have 3 minutes left.
Yeah, you can use a few minutes. That's not
okay. Well, I think I would just actually like to then open it up to questions and discussions. But I think that sort of in closing, one of the things that I would like to say is just that listening to the presentations of today, it's quite astonishing how similar things are that we're working on. That there are so many similar issues and similar ways of addressing it. It's almost like a Jungian synchronicity wave sort of pouring over us that I think that there are opportunities here for collaboration in various areas that could be very exciting.
okay, Tryggvi. Thank you very much. And let us open the floor for questions and discussions. Let's see. So, if I may, you give the you use more Gibson's ecological notion or interactional notion of affordances. Clearly, Norman was a designer, so it's pretty natural that he looked at it from that point of view. We are in the business of designing a curriculum or courses. So in a sense, we are also designers. You gave the example of a virtual teaching assistant. If I look back at other suggestions, let's take the example of that Michael Gödicke gave of using student groups. Then in your approach, you would try to think more holistically about the environment and the interaction between students, isn't it? And could you comment on it?
Yeah. I mean, that's certainly a very good point. And just sort of regarding what you were saying about Don Norman being a designer, that that is certainly correct. And he makes his way into educational discourse through educational design, and it's introduced as a design concept. But I would like to point out that in the seminal literature where the concept of affordances is brought into educational discourse, there are several examples where authors cited or claimed to be citing Gibson, but were actually using the Norman concept. So what I was getting at is that there's confusion there, and but definitely I think, and certainly that working with student groups would be a very significant part of this, because, and I sort of mentioned at the start, that this has to be an inclusive process. And this is one of the challenges with anything having to do with education futures, because education is situated within the social system in a way that a lot of people will claim some sort of ownership, including students, including parents, including government officials. And so these are all parties that can have some impact on any attempts to introduce innovations or policy change. And so they have to be included in that process. But the point is, and what I was sort of getting at is that we are including then people in the process that may not have the insights needed to produce the types of outcomes that would be most helpful. And that's sort of the challenge. And that's where I think that the concept of affordances comes in, that we are at least able to introduce to those who take part in shaping education this concept of affordances that says that things are open, right? And we are the ones who decide what technologies do. Because part of what I do has to do with introducing and implementing new technologies for teaching and that sort of thing. And one of the questions I quite routinely get is, well, you know, cool new technology, but what does it do? And to me, that signals somewhat of a misunderstanding of how technology works, because the technology doesn't do anything. It's a question of what you do with the technology. And sort of one of the things that we quite often see within education is that teachers and those who work with educational technologies have tended to become consumers of technology rather than shaping the technology themselves. And so part of the thinking with the Innovation Center is that both faculty from the School of Education and students, and our students, future teachers, would have opportunities to become acquainted with innovative startup companies that might be working on technologies that would have some impact on education and learning, and be able to become a part of that. And for example, we had a summer course just this past summer, which was taught in collaboration with an international gaming company that is situated here in Iceland called EVE Online, on gaming education. And so there we're both sort of signaling to that company that within the School of Education, there are capacities, there's knowledge, there's skills that could help you to develop your game, while you can certainly provide us with insights about how gaming can affect learning.
Well, thank you very much. Other remarks or questions? If not, then I would like to thank you again.
Thank you.
We will have a 10-minute break, and then we reconvene for the last session at 4:30. Okay, see you later on.